On this episode, we feature a 30-year professional engineer that fell on hard times and found his spirituality. He has created a 7-step process that is helping others change their lives. Author of A Higher Road, a 7-step process to inner peace, joy, love, abundance, and prosperity, I'd like to welcome D Neil Elliott to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for this.
Yeah, and thank you for taking the time to be with us and kind of share your story and talk a little bit about your book. I'm excited to kind of find out what this process is and kind of maybe what you went through, and finding your spirituality. And it's kind of a drastic, it sounds like, I don't know, but it sounds like it might be a drastic change from being an engineer to what you're doing now.
Uh, yeah, it's a big shift, that's for darn sure. So first off, let everybody know the D is to differentiate me on the internet as an author, but so please call me Neil.
Neil, you got it. You got it, Neil.
Okay.
All right. Can you maybe take us back before your awakening to what type of person you were? I want the audience to get a sense of kind of who you were and kind of maybe who you are now.
Yeah, you bet. Let me start with a little bit of background, just so bring everybody up to speed. So, born in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and I've lived in Canada my entire life, and I'm currently 61 years old. Coming up 62, I realize next year or this year. Married, 3 kids, and 5 grandchildren, and all my grandchildren are in Texas. They're all Texans. Professional engineer with a master's of business administration, and worked in the hydroelectric industry for over 30 years. And started out in design engineering, that kind of stuff, and moved into project management. So, over 25, 30 years of project management, managing small projects, a few $100,000 to $100 million. And I was an employee, and in early 2002, in my mid 30s, or I guess it would be in my 40s at that point, I left employment and started working as a consultant. So as an engineer, everybody can imagine, pretty math focused, pretty methodical based, and a lot of tangibility in science, so to speak. So, if I could measure it and calculate it, and then I would believe it. If I could see it, measure it, calculate it, I'd believe it. So that kind of foundation moving forward. But where I found myself was that, and I explain this in my book, but where I found myself was that I had a consciousness, a certain set of beliefs and mindset, and we all do as we grow up and we shape that, that had me fairly negative, fairly judgmental, might denigrate people behind their back, if not to their face, certainly not to their face, because I would try to always be polite. But, that kind of judgmental mindset. And I worked in the corporate world, and I kind of over time, I realized when I hit my 30s that, I need to develop a more positive attitude. So I picked up a bunch of spiritual books, all books we've read, Dr. Wayne Dyer, Carolyn Weiss, Napoleon Hill, all those kinds of self-help books. And I studied them for, 10 years or so, and read them. And I thought, if I do this and I follow these processes and I get into this positive thinking, I'll be able to change, kind of how I thought. None of it, I couldn't really make any of it work for me. I believed it, and I knew that these authors offered great stuff, but I couldn't make it stick for me. And it couldn't shape how I thought. I was right, and that's the way it was, and the other people were wrong. And you kind of group towards people that all think commonly, oh, that person's wrong or whatever. And so you reinforce yourself. And then in 2002, I went into consulting. And so I dropped all the spiritual books because, as a consultant, you work essentially. You don't get paid when you don't work. You don't get paid for stats. You don't get paid for holidays. So you work, work, work. And as a consultant, you always want to put your best foot forward and always deliver for your client so you get return work. And what happened over time is this deep depression set in. And I was working like crazy, and we made some financial decisions which ended up not being great ones, but got us to a point where I was working all kinds of hours, making all kinds of money, and feeling like not getting ahead financially. And I got to this point of deep suicidal depression. And what's the point of life? And I thought, I gotta somehow find something to get me out of this funk. And so in 2014 or so, I started to pick up new issued spiritual books and self-help books, read those, and they offered great processes and good things, but again, couldn't make it do it. And I decided, okay, like there's no point, there's just no point of life. I didn't realize or think, why am I here? Like, I'm working like crazy. I'm not getting ahead. I don't feel good. I'm deeply depressed. And, I'm gonna call it quits. So we had our house for sale for 6 7 years, and it hadn't sold in the 2008 market. It crashed in the area we were in, and it never recovered. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna plan my suicide. Being an engineer, very methodical about it. Our house sold. My wife went to Toronto, Ontario to visit family, and I sat down at we had a house on the beautiful waterfront house in the water, but it was about 4 hours from our clients. So we're in this 1 bedroom apartment. I sat down at the kitchen table of that apartment and crafted my suicide note. Coincidentally, I'd just come across some material about a week before that promised to liberate me if I read it and followed it and studied it. And I thought, okay, as an engineer, I finished my suicide note. I put it aside and I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a chance. I had this nagging, I'm not Christian, I grew up agnostic, I had this nagging doubt that if I committed suicide, I'd go to hell. And I didn't, I was a little uncertain. But I just read a near death experience from a woman that, and we can talk a little bit about that. But essentially, she came back with a bunch of messages. And one of them was, you're not judged after you die. So no matter what you do here, you're not judged. So that kind of alleviated, I didn't really understand it or what she was talking about, but that alleviated that bit of doubt. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to commit suicide. But as I said, I came across this other blueprint material, I call it. And I thought, okay, well, I'll stick that aside. I can always commit suicide. I can't come back from that, but I can study this document. If it doesn't work, I'll commit suicide. A year to the day after following this process, which I've documented in A Higher Road, a year to the day, I woke up and depression entirely gone. I felt full of love and peace and joy. I felt entirely different than I'd ever felt in my entire life. Maybe as a 5-year-old, I felt that way. I don't know, but any conscious recollection of my life, I felt entirely different. I didn't judge people anymore. I didn't denigrate people anymore. I didn't believe people were wrong. They just had a different point of view. Essentially, I just transformed my consciousness, and that changed my life. And I wanted to, kind of get on the top of rooftops and share this information with everybody. But I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be looked at like a nutcase. So I decided after a couple of years, the best way to do this is to document it in a book. So I've put this process in a book to share with people. And the method that I recommend for people to read my book is read it from cover to cover. Decide for yourself whether this process makes sense to you. And if it does, then go back and start with some of the science stuff that I discuss, or go directly into starting step one. So that's kind of how I came about, and, kind of the impetus for writing this book.
What was the book that helped you, that kind of stopped you?
So there's a couple things. So one is, and when you read my book, you'll understand this. I don't share, I've gathered all of this material, and I've pulled it into a compendium, and I share this with people after they've read A Higher Road. It's free. I give it to them for free. but I don't disclose what it is or what information it is. It's a bunch of information. I don't disclose what that is up front because how it is presented and how it's branded, if you will,
Uh-huh.
um, I would have run from it, and most people would run from it. They would just
Right.
discount it.
That makes
And
sense.
and so what I want to do is I want to take people through this process of of this information that I share in a higher road and also in this blueprint document bridges this gap between spirituality and science. And so you need to come at this information first with some scientific understanding and get everybody, so my book's laid out this way to get everybody on the same page and get everybody up to speed with some various science stuff. And then you need to come at this other information like a little child, no judgment, full of wonder, full of joy, and really open. And so I've designed a higher road to get people to this place as open as I can get them before I present this material to them.
Yeah, that
So go ahead.
I was just gonna say that that makes a lot of sense to me. Because I've read some books like that where they kind of try to maybe merge science with spirituality. I think it's important for maybe people who are very critical thinkers and very nuts and bolts type of maybe an upbringing, just to kind of get them on board at first for them to make sense. I know Dr. Joe Dispenza does a nice job with some of the stuff that he writes about with that. So I can relate to that is what I'm getting at, and I think that's a pretty cool approach.
Yeah, and people that have read my book, I've got feedback that I had one person right up front tell me they got into it, they read it, and their comment to me, their initial comment to me after they read it was, I had no idea what I was getting into. Like this is just so amazing, and they were everybody pretty much. I haven't had any negative feedback on this at all in terms of this approach. So my goal is to put it this way: in order for us to change the consciousness of the world, no one can do it for you. You can't shop it out. You can't phone it in. You got to do the work yourself. And when we individually can change our consciousness to one of love and one of peace and one of joy, over time, collectively, we will start to be like this. We will be kind of like a beacon of light for others to be curious about it. And we will eventually create a new era of love and peace throughout the world. And so, my contribution, this is what I believe, my contribution in this is to help people understand that they have the power and they can change their consciousness from wherever they are, whether they're ill or healthy or rich or poor or educated or uneducated, living on a street or living in a mansion. If they would like to actually open themselves up and actually understand creation and what we do moment by moment to create every experience and every event that comes into our life. As soon as you have this information and these kinds of tools and understand it, you can choose to change your life.
Yeah,
And the
you're
choice is
basically
yours.
tapping into the quantum realm, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's brilliant. So you talked a little bit about like that moment when you were writing the suicide note. I mean, is there some other turning points that you could pick up on that like kind of influenced your spirituality or solidified things? Because you said, you woke up exactly a year later and you felt, just a sense of love and peace. But was there like something in between that was like a turning point or something that where you slowly started to change?
Good question. Let me come at this from a little bit, I'll back up a little bit more and then we'll come into that. So I when I picked up these new books to read in 2014 or so, there were some key books for me regarding our beliefs and and science that started to help me shift how I was thinking. Now, they wouldn't have done it on their own, but what it did is it laid this foundation. So let me go back to how I've constructed a higher road, just so everybody knows this. So, part one of my book is really an overview of my emotional state that I was in and the impetus for my transformation and what you're going to learn by, reading the rest of a higher road. That's part one of the book. Part two is a memoir of my life, and I use it as an illustration. And I'm typically a very private person. I don't talk about myself about these things, but I crafted this memoir in a very candid way because what I wanted to do was show people, illustrate to people how my thinking and my belief system and my emotions created my all these experiences in my life and shaped the direction I was going. And I do that so that after somebody's read my book, if they want to go back and get personal insights about their own life, they have a bit of an idea of, kind of how I shaped my own life and brought these experiences into my life. So they can go back and maybe look at their own life if they're interested. Then part three of this book. So now part three, I talk about consciousness. And my former belief in consciousness was that, consciousness was in my brain and everything that I thought about or believed to be right or wrong, true or false, or, anything that came into my brain, I thought was already in my brain through either, exposure in my childhood or learning or, some other event, something that I experienced and it somehow got stored in my brain. My concept of consciousness now is entirely different. Consciousness for me now is not only in my brain and in my body, but surrounds us. And these thoughts that come into my brain, yes, some of them may have originated in my brain, but I see them now as this stream of things that go by me in consciousness. And I choose a thought, and we do this in a nanosecond. We choose a thought, we look at it, we decide whether we like it, we're going to think about it and dwell on it, and, kind of massage it, or we reject it, throw it back, and we pick another thought. And I would have never have thought that before. So if that's the first thing for me was just this new concept of consciousness and understanding how everything that we read or watch or expose ourselves to or the people we talk to shape how we think and how we feel. And, I read a book which I share as a recommended read. Someone doesn't have to read it, but one of the books I read was around mind and memes and what that book did for me was it reinforced that, all of these things that we view or we watch or we read about shapes how we think and feel. But the primary thing it did for me was it actually convinced me that everything I believe to be right or wrong, true or false, good or bad, is really just a belief. So the next thing that, kind of I read, which influenced me, was that it was around mind and cells, and it was an author that a scientist that actually described how what we think and what we feel affects the expression of a cell. So essentially the work that it does. And through our thinking and our feeling, we actually change our biology. And we can either promote the health of our cells or draw illness into our cells. So that's another thing. And that's all based on research and, something tangible.
Yeah,
Again, the engineer, something tangible.
absolutely. From what I understand, like for example, if I think I used this the other day on my show, but for an example, like if somebody's been abused and you think about it throughout your lifetime, it's almost like you're being abused over and over, because your cells and your they don't recognize the difference between just your thoughts and it really happening. It's almost like it's really happening again, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good
So
example.
I mean, I could see how that could promote sickness, disease, that kind of thing, with like bad, negative thoughts, or yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great example that you used. So then the next thing that I read, which influenced me again, just reinforced this around the mind and the cells, but it was really around the mind and the brain. And um, it was some information or some again, it was one was by a researcher, a scientific researcher. The other was by actually a physician, a doctor, and how science has discovered that people with brain injuries can do two things. I'll back up a moment. They used to believe, science used to believe that the brain was fixed. You got it, you grew it, and then as you got older, it aged and it died. And in the 60s, I think it was, they discovered that the brain is actually neuroplastic, that you can build new brain cells. And through research since then, they've discovered that there's things people can do that experience brain injuries and then the resulting issues associated with those brain injuries, that they can actually rewire the brain, develop new neural pathways, and correct some of those issues that they experience as a result of those injuries, if not eliminate them.
Yeah.
And so go ahead. What are you going to say?
I was just gonna say, I know another example, that's psilocybin can do that to the human brain, change
Yeah.
your neural pathways and things like that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Did not know that.
interesting. It's just interesting that you said that. That's
Yeah. So anyway, that I put, so I in a higher road, I tell you what books and what authors I read that kind of influenced and shaped my thinking. Then I read this book by this woman who experienced a near death experience. And she's written a book, and I recommend everybody read this book. But she has a particularly clear and profound description of what happens after we die. And she was a woman that, she was in her 40s. She had suffered 4 years from this aggressive cancer, and it essentially riddled her body with these tumors. And she had weeping lesions, open lesions. And over that 4 year period, she went down to about 75 pounds. She couldn't hold her head up. She was on oxygen all of the time. She fell into a coma. They rushed her to the hospital. And the admitting physicians told her husband she wouldn't make it through the night. 24 hours later, roughly, she woke up and she declared she'd be okay. And 2 weeks later, they couldn't find a trace of cancer in her body. And so her book is about her experience. And this is all, again, medically documented. And, the physicians and that are, they're studying it and they're looking at it. They can't explain it. They just call it a miraculous remission, so to speak. And her description of what she experienced in that 24-hour period, roughly, of when she was in her coma, was really, and I'm using the word colorful language, not in a nasty sense, but really colorful language and descriptive language that just really stretched my understanding of consciousness. So I was already shaping my thinking around what consciousness was, and what I believed to be true or false was really just a belief. And then I read this NDE that just really stretched what I thought. So she came back with some specific message. There's a lot of messages she came back with for us to consider, but she came back with things, and this seemed really believable to me. So this was another little foundational piece for me that was based medically documented, and something we could visually see. Really sick to cancer all gone. Things like we come from love, we return to love. When she was in that coma, she felt like She was just bathed in unconditional love. And we don't have the human language to describe this, is what she says. And I'm going to echo this, but um, we don't have the human language to describe it. So she felt like she's totally in this bathed in this unconditional love and not judged for anything. So not judged when we come back. She also felt like she expanded to become part of everything in the universe, where there was another person, a planet, a rock, a tree. And so she came back with things like, um, we are, consciousness is a part of everything. There's like this increased expansion of consciousness. So really that book described for me and opened me up to this whole new understanding of consciousness. And so then we got into, then I got into, after that, I both in a higher road go now into this blueprint material, but that's when I started to read this blueprint document or this material. And what this material does is it builds on things that we know in science and bridges that gap between science and spirituality. So the next part of my book part 4, is really it's the foundation for spiritual enlightenment, and um, and in that part 4, I also provide some excerpts of that material to give everybody an idea of the brilliance of the writing and the clarity and the I'm going to say ease of understanding. It's worded in a way which is really easy to understand, but I can tell you that you don't really understand it until you go through this process that I described in these 7 steps. And when you do that, and that involves meditation, so you're going to learn how to meditate at some point in these 7 steps. And it's a meditation that I learned as I was following these 7 steps. And I had tried meditation in the 90s, and I kept doing it, in the 2000s and stuff. And one thing I never really understood was, why do we meditate? And everybody has reasons for that. Oh, you're calmer, it lowers your blood pressure. There's a bunch of things for it. But I can tell you now, in my opinion and my belief, is that the real reason for meditation, the real purpose of meditation, is to get you in connection with the source of our being. And when you follow this process over time, what will happen is your beliefs will imperceptibly start to change. And as you continue with your meditation and you continue this process, I'll tell you what happened to me. 7 months after I started this process, I started to feel this little weird thing at the top of my head, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I was told what it was going to be, but I didn't recognize it because I'd never felt it before. And essentially what's happening is, as you go through this process, you are building new brain cells at the top of your brain underneath your skull, and you will develop an opening in the top of your head. And it starts small and it grows gradually over time, as long as you're persistent and dedicated with this process. And so initially I felt, oh, that's kind of weird. I wonder what that is like. But after, a few weeks, it's like that just started to get bigger and bigger. And I finally realized, oh, that's what's happening, is I'm getting this opening at the top of my head with these new brain cells. And then what happens is I had an inflow of spiritual energy into my head. And then eventually it would go into my chest, and then in my solar plexus. It would go up one side, go down one side of my body, up the other, fill my whole body. And at some point, that the things that you're learning about creation and about how we create our every tomorrows is actually true. And when this spiritual energy fills you, and I describe this, so the last part of my book is my experience as I followed these 7 steps. And so as you feel this energy in your body and in your head or in your solar plexus or in your chest, or all 3, you will eventually know that what you know is true. And over time, that belief will become unshakable. Doesn't matter what anybody says to me. I know it's true, and it doesn't really matter. And anybody can experience this. You have a
It's
body.
interesting that with meditation you can pick up on stuff like that. It's almost like it is a connection to source, but it's you can learn a lot, right? It's like you're being taught. Um, I think somebody once said that like prayer is like talking to God, but meditation is more like listening to God and gaining
Oh,
understanding
that's
from
good.
God. Yeah. And there's some truth to that, man. I could buy into that. I think what you say makes sense. I do believe wholeheartedly that, like you said, there's a lot of reasons for meditation, but I think the number one reason would be to connect to source.
Yes. So my book, A Higher Road, and this information I'm sharing transcends all religions. So whether you want to call it God, Yahweh, Allah, the divine, source, our creator, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same. There's only one creator.
That's right. There is only one creator. You're absolutely
Only
right.
one creator. So so let me talk about, unless you have some questions, let me talk a little bit about science. So what do we know today that we didn't know 100 years ago, 200 years ago? And what we know today is that there's nothing solid under the sun. There's nothing solid in the universe. At a subatomic level, we are just energy. And science believes,
99.9% space, right? Something like
yeah,
that.
exactly. And that we know that intellectually from science, that we are more space than solid. But our perception is that we're solid. You can't put your finger through your arm. Sorry, you can't put your finger through your arm. And we're solid. And we believe, and our perception of it is such that we let our externalities, our external environment drive how we think and what we think about. And life really, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but life really is a journey within. And if you can understand this and you have so what I needed something that was tangible, something that made sense to me from a scientific perspective, but bridged this spiritual piece. And then you need the process. And in my opinion, that if you have this and you have this process, and then if you follow the process, you can experience the same kind of stuff, if not even greater than what I experienced. And so we'll carry on with some science stuff here. So, you know, science knows now, we know today that there's nothing solid, everything's just energy. Science believes that, there was a Big Bang, and they don't know what was before the Big Bang. That's always bothered me. Okay, well, what was before the Big Bang, and why was there a Big Bang? So that was always kind of curious for me. But science believes there was a Big Bang. They measure it, and they believe that everything that came out of that Big Bang is what we know today, what we can see, the planets, everything else, including electromagnetism. They say electromagnetism just is, it came out of the Big Bang, and that's the end of it. It just is.
Sounds like a
And
cop
that,
out to me.
well, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but, science can't measure it. So the source of our being, so I'll talk about this in a moment. The source of our being is in silence and stillness, and it's in equilibrium. And so no matter how we measure, how we probe science, how we probe space, how we measure it, how we observe it, we're never going to be able to, from a scientific perspective, understand what it is. The only way you're going to understand this is you have to start with a spiritual perspective. And when you make this connection, you will understand. So science believes this electromagnetism kind of randomly got together through fusion and created elements, right? Created atoms. And then those combined to form elements randomly. And then randomly they got together to form a living molecule. And randomly those living molecules got together and formed a living cell. And then evolution on, kind of what's alive and what we see today, plants, animals, people. And so the question is, when did consciousness first creep into living matter? And so if we talk about a cell, let's talk about a spell. Let's talk about a cell. We'll talk about a body and then a cell. So the sperm fertilizes the ovum, you get one fertilized cell. It divides into two, divides into four, and so on. We know from science today that every cell in the body has the entire library of information required for the entire body. The only difference between cells is the work it does. And cells have worked together so harmoniously. They never intrude on another person's work. They always work together to build. So when they're building a liver, they are focused on building the liver. They never spring into making a nose or a toe. They're always building the liver. They don't intrude on each other's work. There's more harmony in the work in our cells, in our body, than we display as humans when we're working on a project or anything, any other joint activity. And so you think about that, one cell that divides the entire libraries in it, they focus on their own work, they don't intrude, and they, the stuff they do to maintain the health of that body and whatever organ or skin or bone that they're building. The cell is this unique thing. It has a nucleus, but it has this permeable membrane. And this permeable membrane will only let in the right nutrition. And so the cell can discern, oh, this is the nutrition that is good for me. It lets in that right nutrition. It discerns that there's toxic waste buildup, and it has enough discernment to say, I got to get rid of that toxic waste so it doesn't, harm me. So that in itself is a first act of consciousness that we can think about. That is the hallmark of consciousness, to be able to make a choice and then discern that, there's waste buildup and get rid of that waste so it doesn't harm you. So if we can scientifically understand that consciousness is in a cell, then the question is, well, why wouldn't it be in the living molecules that supposedly randomly got together? Why wouldn't it be in the living molecules that actually formed a living cell? And by the way, where does this directional consciousness come from? The impetus for this. And if it's in the living molecules that got together to form a living cell, why not in the elements that combine to form a living molecule? And if in the living elements, if you can go back this far, if in the living elements, why not in the energy particles that got together to form the atoms? So you can see this link now to electromagnetism, that there's some directional force with this electromagnetism to, as the impetus for creation. And so when you follow all 7 steps, if you learn all 7 steps and you follow all 7 steps in a higher road, you will understand what was before the Big Bang. You'll understand the impetus for the Big Bang. You'll understand what came out of the Big Bang and how electromagnetism came into being. And then you will understand how we use electromagnetism unknowingly, unwittingly, ignorantly to create every experience in our life. And so I'll talk a little bit about that because the other stuff you really need to read for yourself, but I'll give you a couple things about that. So universal consciousness was before the Big Bang, and it was comprised of primary impulses. When it was split, it split into divine consciousness. Universal consciousness still exists. It's in silence and stillness and equilibrium, never be measured by science. And then divine consciousness came out of that, and it is both in silence and stillness in equilibrium, and it also works through electromagnetism to create form. And we use electromagnetism. So we have, to a very limited extent, limited extents, the same creative power that does our source of being has. And we use that through our thinking and our feeling. We think with electrical impulses in the brain, and we feel with magnetic impulses in our nervous system. The thinking part of the brain, the electrical impulses in our brain, creates a consciousness plan, and the magnetic impulses in our nervous system center and bond those electrical impulses into a form, into a purpose. Anything that you desire or think about or have a purpose that you want or don't want, because the universe does not differentiate between I don't like this and I do like this. If you don't like something, you're still thinking about it, is still a consciousness plan. If I do like it and you're thinking about it, it's still a consciousness plan. You will create these life forms. So our consciousness is around our bodies. It's out here in space, and it's lying there like, in a dormant state doing nothing. But then we create these little life forms, blueprints of future experiences that come into our life. And the more we think about them and the more we feel about them, they will attract to us, be it in an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 15 years, next lifetime. And as we do this, we draw these events into our life. So now you think about, okay, well, I have these negative, denigrating, judgmental thoughts, slanderous thoughts. And what I'm doing is I'm creating these life forms all around me, and I'm magnet. The more I think about them, the more I dwell on them, the more the stronger that magnetic pull begins, and it starts to draw the same things into my life. And things that you do today, you will draw something into your life in the future, and you will never be able to link it because you'll just forgot about what you did today. And it is a law of cause and effect. What you create has to come into form. And until we wake up to the fact that this is what we're doing, we will continue to do this individually and then collectively. Your soul comes from divine consciousness. Your soul is perfect. It is unconditional love. And as we develop from childhood to adulthood, we bind our soul down and shut it off from the light. Just going to pause. I need a drink.
Yeah, that's well said, man. I think I definitely see your engineering background coming out and your attention to detail and explanation on things. It's very fascinating. Do you think then perhaps what is the material world then? Is it just a reflection of consciousness kind of looking
Oh,
back at itself? I mean, what if everything is empty space, why the need for a material world? Like what I mean, it's obviously conscious driven. There's a reason behind it. I mean, consciousness doesn't just do things out of accident.
yeah, there's no, that's a great question. So let's not forget that I was at, as we bind down our soul. Okay. So let's come back to that. I'll answer your question. um, we as humans believe that we are matter imbued with consciousness. In reality, we are consciousness made visible through the descent of vibrational frequency of electrical particles. What we know in science, we don't know how to do this, but we can know in science that the only difference between a rock and a loaf of bread is the density of the electrical particles and the vibrational frequency of those particles. If you could change the density of those particles and the vibrational frequency, you could make a rock into bread, or vice versa. So we are consciousness, and there's a purpose for this. And so let me go back to this little Um, so at the time of conception, the human ego is created, and your soul is perfect, is a fragment of divine consciousness, and we are unified in divine consciousness. But we come here so our soul can learn. We come to our school of earth so our soul can learn the lessons it needs to learn through many lifetimes. And you will be reincarnated with different places of origin, in different colors of skin, through different educational experiences, uneducated, educated. Sometimes you may be wealthy, and other times you may be living on the street. And you're going to have all these various experiences, male and female, different colors of skin, different place of origin, different language, different religions, different politics, so that you can learn the lessons you need to learn. And until your soul wakes up and understands that the what it's doing to itself through its thinking and feeling, you will continue to experience the things you experience and all the vagrancies of life, of illnesses or depression or other things that finally wakes the soul up. And when the soul finally wakes up and realizes what it's doing, and if you can have a process, you can then work to cleanse your consciousness and rebuild it with the golden qualities of divine consciousness that is consistent with the source of our being. And when you start to do this process, you will connect with the divine, and you will have this spiritual inflow of energy, and you will have help in doing this and cleansing your consciousness from the source of our being. And when you complete this process, whether it's this lifetime or another lifetime, and you fully transcend your ego, you will be able to, when you pass from that lifetime, this or the next, you will be able to step into the light. And that's when you let your real life begin. You will not have to be reincarnated again. And we as human beings let our, like I said before, let our externalities drive what we think and what we believe. Everything that you see is a reflection of your belief. You change your beliefs, you see things differently. None of your external environment may change, but I
So
tell
well
you,
said.
you can change exactly how you're feeling. So when at the time of conception, the human ego is created, and the little I mind of ego takes control. And that any baby born into a house of privilege, so to speak, where you have kind of care, and you have loving parents, and you have food, is the embodiment of joy. And the human mind doesn't, I can't remember the exact psychological, you might know this, but the human mind developing this discernment and making its own decisions probably around age 5 or 6. And so, as a baby, you're a sponge. You feel what your parents feel or people around you. You're paying attention. You're just soaking
Right.
up everything that
Right.
that is in your environment, right? So you've come in with certain things that you want to deal with in this lifetime, or things that you created in your last lifetime that will now become a mountain in this lifetime for you to deal with. But you're also being shaped by what your parents think and feel, and by their friends, what they think and feel, anybody that's around you. So you start to develop these beliefs. And then as you get from age 5 to adulthood, you think you're becoming versed in the ways of the world. And really what you're doing is you're shutting your soul off from the connection of the divine, from the light, and the ability to communicate with the divine.
Yeah.
And
I think you're kind of talking about like the understanding of self, possibly like by age 5, you start to understand that you're separate or different. But that makes sense what you're saying though, as far as I don't know what the word is, but like just almost becoming separated from the divine or from It's that's strange that we have to go through that process.
Well, when you finish all 7 steps, you'll understand why you're going through this process. I promise you, you will. Um, and there's reasons for it because you need to. So it's hard to describe in a short period of time. And really, it takes quite a bit of understanding and meditation to get it. But I can promise you will understand it if you spend the time doing it and you follow all 7 steps. But there's a purpose for your soul to come here. And so it's coming here to learn these lessons, and it's coming here to experience the things that it needs to experience so that the collective, the divine, can experience itself in all of the different aspects. And so, as we do this, we shut off our soul from connection with the divine and the light. Now, the divine is always radiating unconditional love. It's just that you can't feel it and you don't know it and you block it by your belief system. And so when you wake up to that and you start to go through this process, and it's a very specific process of cleansing your consciousness, when you go through this process, then you start to rid yourself of all of these false beliefs. And then you start to rebuild your consciousness. And that's a very specific process. You start to rebuild your consciousness. And when you do that, you open yourself up to a higher frequency of vibration. And this is when you start making connection with the divine. So I describe how this felt in the last chapter of my book, as I'm describing as I go through these processes. And so I'll share this one with you, is that about a year and 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after I started this process, I had this meditation where I went into this state of just pure unconditional love. I can't describe it. We don't have the language to describe it. And I didn't care what happened to my body. I didn't care what pain it had, what illness it had. I just wanted to stay in that state forever. And I believe that is just a glimpse of what you're going to feel when you pass from this lifetime. Right now, we forget where we came from, but our soul is always trying to get back to the state of unconditional love. The issue is that our ego only has the tools of electromagnetism to create that happiness or safety in our life. So what it does is it bonds with everything it likes. I like chocolate ice cream. I like that kind of cake. I like that kind of car. I like that kind of house. I like that person. I don't like, and then it rejects everything it doesn't. I don't like that person. I don't like that kind of food. I don't like to live in that area. I don't want to travel to that place. And so we, through our beliefs, we create these experiences in our lives through creating these blueprints via this electromagnetism, which is the only mechanism the ego has to create these experiences in our life. And these are all just part of this developing process for the soul. And when you understand this, you can start this process to transcend your ego. And I can tell you, it is the most beautiful, wonderful, amazing process that you will ever experience. And then you begin to get this connection, and then you begin to remember. When I look at people now, what I see, no matter how they're behaving on the outside, I know exactly why everybody is doing what they're doing. I know exactly why they're, saying what they're saying. And what I see is I see the beauty and the love of their soul, because our souls are all equal. Our souls are all unconditional love. Our souls are all perfect. And if you can see beyond this outside externality of people, you can see that they are really love at the core of their being, and they are creating these experiences that you're also participating in to learn lessons that they need to learn. Your life changes. I tell you, it's an amazing process. And I want to share it with everybody. I wish everybody would read my book so that they can make their own choice. And you read my book and you decide at the end that no, you're not interested in it, please pass the book on to somebody else without colorful commentary. Just say, hey, that you might be interested in this. It's an interesting read, because you can never accurately judge the inner reality of another person. Someone who's very affable and pleasant and kind could be an absolute misery inside.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I got just two more questions for you before I let you off the hook here. If you had maybe, aside from telling people to read your book, because I think your book can probably provide a lot of help for a lot of people. But if you had one piece of advice to say to somebody who's maybe struggling with inner peace, kind of what would you say to them, and maybe what direction would you put them on?
Uh, that's a good question. I have to ponder that for a moment. I think the first thing, and it sounds so, it's something that somebody might have said to me, and I would say, look, you see life through rose-colored glasses. It's true, but I don't know whether people actually will hear it. But the first thing I'd say to somebody is, no matter where you are in life, you can change how you think. What you need is, you need the knowledge and you need the process to do it. And if you're open for that, if you can be open to that, and you can spend your time on it and follow it, you can actually change entirely how you feel. And if you were living on the street, if someone who is materially impoverished and can't eat can't learn. So if you're going to teach people that are materially impoverished and try and help them, you need to make sure that their bellies are full, because that's the only way the brain is going to learn. And so, if we can do that, and we can teach people, they will make their own choice, because it's going to be, entirely dependent on where they are in their spiritual journey. But people that are open to it, and if they can come to this information as a little child full of curiosity and wonder, they have the opportunity to learn this and to entirely change their life.
Well said. Is there any plans for works of another book?
Um, One is starting to I'm getting inspiration for another one.
That's
So
good.
this is not, by the way, all of this information, like, anything about me personally is me, but
Mhm.
anything that I said today that you consider to be brilliant, don't consider it from me. Consider it from a much higher source than me. I'm merely the messenger.
Yeah, but you articulate it in a way that's understandable and relatable and makes sense. Well, that's good. I think perhaps you found a different path, and I hope you do continue to write. And where can the listeners find the work that you're doing and pick up one of your books?
Yeah, absolutely. So, A Higher Road: Cleanse Your Consciousness to Transcend the Ego and Ascend Spiritually. And it's a 7-step process to inner peace, joy, love, abundance, and prosperity. You can learn more about it on my website, which is dneilelliott.com. That's DNEILELLIOTT.com. All of my social media links are on there. And there's also, under my book on that website, you can request the first chapter for free, and I'll send that to you in a PDF if you're interested. The book's available on Amazon in paperback, hardcover, or ebook. You can also pick it up in your local bookstores, or get it in your other favorite, you know, ebook versions, Kobo and, Nook and those other things, Apple, iPad. So freely available, or not freely available, but easily available at your fingertips, and it's available globally through local bookstores or Amazon.
Excellent, Neil. Thanks for coming on the show. It's been
It's been
wonderful.
my pleasure. It's been my pleasure, and I really hope that, my goal is to help create a new era of love and peace in the world, and we have to do that in each individually.
That's beautiful.